The Best Garden in Boone County award was to be given out in 2 days, and I was not to be outdone. This was my year. I could feel it deep in my gut, at the pit of my stomach. We're talking about the holy grail of garden awards. Best Garden of the Year in this part of the country, major bragging rights. This was something women and their husbands bragged about to one another all the time. To be named Best Garden in the whole county was the equivalent of being chosen Best Actress at the Oscars for all of us folks in Boone County. For the past several years, Miss Patty Carmichael had received the accolades, and you could always hear her husband Jerry blabbering on and on about it to his fellow lawyer friends at their company parties. Rick, my husband, would always come home and tell me what he said. "My Patty has the most beautiful daisies," he would say. Or, my favorite, "She's always out in her garden tittering away. She's a shoo-in this year." Patty wasn't a shoo-in this year. I was going to bring home the title even if I had to kill someone to do it. I'd spent hours and hours in the dirt and sweltering heat, making sure all my flowers and vegetables were watered, trimmed, and growing the way they were supposed to. I checked everything once, twice, 3 times, maybe 4 to ensure my garden was perfect. Flawless. I dug my hands into dry dirt, pulled up armies of weeds with raw, bloodied palms. My hands sure knew the lengths to which I would go to win this competition, with my dry and brittle fingertips always dancing on the edge of cracking open and bleeding. The knuckles were no better. Patty, Joanne, Derryberry, and I were the only contestants who'd bothered to enter the competition this year. After last year's fiasco with Miss Kelly Smith's tomatoes, a terrible tragedy involving her family and the judges ingesting some form of ricin that had been injected into each fruit, everyone was too scared to plant anything. Blame was passed around the community. Everyone thought someone in the contest was the culprit, and it certainly had to be the case. The blame was pointed at Patty first. The gossip had spread like wildfire around town that Kelly had something special in store in her garden that year. And instead of taking second place like a good sport, Patty took matters into her own hands and poisoned her tomatoes. She was not going to lose her first place spot. But when police investigated the claim, nothing came of it. So, blame was passed to me. I was interrogated, investigated, poked, and prodded. My house was searched, but my history was squeaky clean. There wasn't anything to find here. I kept cameras in my garden in hopes that whatever happened to Kelly Smith's tomatoes would not happen to my plants and flowers. I would not be sabotaged like her. This year, my prized piece was my daughter plant. Known for its parasitic nature, daughter plants liked to feed on other plants by attaching themselves to their host via a special organ, the hostorium, and withdrawing nutrients from them. The judges would wonder why I grew such a villainous, leafless plant in my garden when it very well could take over and rule the rest of my flowers and vegetables, sucking the life out of them as well. The truth is, I let it feed on my chrysanthemums and hoped that it wouldn't spread any further than them. I was taking a huge leap of faith. One I wasn't sure was the best decision, but I knew it would earn some major points in creativity. I glanced over at the brownish-yellow, slender, string-like stems of my daughter plant wrapping around my orange and yellow chrysanthemums. It looked like an easel full of paint had exploded on the plants. Colors expanded in each crevice, bright and vibrant in the sunlight, bearing down on them. The daughter's flowers and nodule-like clusters made up of tiny yellow or white bell-like united petals mixed with the chrysanthemum blooms, swallowing them whole. The sheer boldness of my choices would definitely make me this year's shoo-in. Forget Patty and her plain white daisies. Hello, over-the-top parasitic plants and new beginnings. The day of the judging, we all gathered around the Boone County Courthouse Square. I glared at Patty and Jerry, hoping they could sense the hatred radiating from my body. She had taken this title from me for 5 years, but this year would be different. I could feel it in my bones. Rick looped his arm around my waist and nuzzled his nose into my ear. "You got this in the bag, Shelby," he whispered, sending a chill down my spine. No matter what I did, Rick was always there to support me. You're damn right I've got this in the bag. I took his hand into mine, squeezing it lightly as Horace Hayes, the judge executive of Boone County, bellowed into the microphone, alerting the crowd before him that the judging was soon to start.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen,
Horace said, a wide white smile spreading across his thin lips. His teeth were so brilliantly white they almost looked fake.
And welcome to the annual Boone County Garden Competition. We'll be taking a look at 3 gardens today. One from Miss Patty Carmichael, another from Joanne Derryberry, and the final garden from Miss Shelby Lyons. Join me in congratulating these 3 fine young women for their hard work this year, preparing their gardens for the contest.
All of maybe 20 people clapped their hands in celebratory applause. There wasn't a great turnout this year, most likely due to Kelly's tomatoes. Usually there was a huge crowd and the courthouse square was filled with people. What had changed this year?
Are you ready for this year's competition to commence?
Horace asked the crowd, and everyone cheered once again. I forced a smile, feeling a sense of pride course through my body, surging at the center of my chest. I had suffered blood, sweat, and tears for this moment. It was my time to shine. Each contestant was to set up a time for Horace to visit their garden and evaluate it. Usually a small crowd of people followed him to the sites. He judged on the following scale: aesthetic appeal, including beauty and effective design, plant health and production, sustainability practices, habitat for beneficial wildlife, social connections to family, neighborhood, or community, and creativity. We were also to provide him with a sheet of statistics and explanations on the plant's growth in our gardens. I certainly took a chance with my daughter plant and its sustainability practices. The plant itself was only sustainable if it were feeding off another plant's growth. My chrysanthemums wouldn't last forever, and I would soon need to find it a new host. But my main goal was hoping the daughter plants would give me an edge. Hopefully Horace would understand that, as I explained in my facts sheet that I would give him later.
Thank you everyone for the generous ovation,
Horace said, once the applause had died into a continuous whisper. Eyes roamed through the crowd from me to Patty to Joanne. The scrutiny was palpable. No matter how much I wanted to win this competition, one thing I didn't like was being under the constant attention of people in our community.
Miss Patty Carmichael's garden judging will take place at 1:30 p.m. Miss Joanne's will take place at 2:30, and we'll wrap up the evening with Miss Shelby's garden at 3:30 p.m.
This left me approximately 2.5 hours to prepare and to clean up any last-minute blemishes. My heart thudded faster in my chest. I looked Rick dead in the face, squeezing his hand a little tighter, his green eyes showing a hint of longing and excitement. I knew mine must have looked quite dark, because Rick's excitement didn't last very long. The wrinkle line across his forehead disappeared with his smile. "Let's go," I said, pulling him towards our truck parked a few places down from the crowd. The old, rusty Ford was patiently waiting for us, ready to take us home. I didn't care to see Patty or Joanne's garden. They had nothing on mine. This was my year to win. As Murphy's Law states, if anything can go wrong, it will. That seems to be the case when Rick pulled into our gravel driveway, rocks crunching underneath the truck's tires. From the road I could see my garden, and I could definitely see that my chrysanthemums had started to wilt and brown, signaling the end of life for the flower. The daughter plant had sucked too much life out of it too soon. I climbed out of the truck before Rick even shifted into park and ran over to the daughter. It was firmly grasped onto the chrysanthemum, so there was no way I could pull the dying flower away from its grasp before Horace arrived. "No, no, no," I muttered under my breath, hoping Rick couldn't hear the urgency in my voice. The last thing I needed was him concerned too. I love to support in my endeavors, but sometimes I just needed to figure things out on my own.
"Everything okay?"
Rick asked, placing his hand gently on my shoulder. I shrugged him off. "Yeah," I sighed. "It's fine. Just go inside. I'll be there in a minute. Instead of putting up a fight, Rick made his way into our house. He knew better than to bother me while I was working, and he definitely knew better than to ask about any last-minute details of my plans. I moved the daughter around, placing strands of it strategically to hide the browning and wilting of the chrysanthemum. When I was finished, no one would ever notice the difference. But the more I moved the plant, the stiffer it got, like it was trying to fight against me. I pulled at a few strands, and they wouldn't budge. I was careful, though, because the daughter strings were fragile, and any one of them would shed off if I wasn't too careful. As I got closer to covering all the imperfections of the chrysanthemum and moving one last section of the daughter, a sharp pain scattered throughout my hand. I yanked my hand back, wincing, pulling it to my chest. When I looked down, I saw a small pinprick in my thumb, like a needle had punctured my skin, drawing a tiny droplet of blood to the surface. I must have nicked it on one of the strings of the daughter. As I wiped my hand on my jeans, though, the shooting pain traveled from my hand to my forearm, sending sharp bursts of agony through the bones and muscle. I let out a cry of pain, gripping my wrist. What was happening?
It was you, wasn't it?
Something whispered near me, like a snake slithering out of its hiding place. I looked around, my head jerking from left to right. For a second, I thought maybe Rick had come back out to check on me, but he was nowhere to be found, likely still in the house.
You poisoned her fruits.
The voice was light and wispy, yet terrifying, like it was almost in pain. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It sounded so close, but no one could be seen for miles. The sharp pain in my hand had jolted its way up the length of my arm, stopping at my shoulder. I let out a cry.
Shelby, you did it.
The voice whispered again, and my heart started pounding in my chest.
You poisoned the tomatoes.
I kept looking around me, turning circles amidst my flowers, and could see nothing. I searched frantically, looking down at my daughter plants to see it squirming and moving, sliding between chrysanthemum blooms and dried-up leaves.
Cheater.
The voice started again, and at this point I realized the sound was coming from the daughter plant. It was somehow talking to me.
Cheater.
It said again, and I looked down in agony. I was still gripping my wrist because the pain in my arm had not let up. I couldn't speak. Something was making my tongue swell up like a piece of thick, dried cotton stuffed into my cheek.
You don't deserve this award.
I started crying, tears streaming down my face in full, thick waterfalls. My legs were wobbly, but I managed to move my feet, backing up slowly. Before I could go any further, the daughter plant flung one of its strings towards me, wrapping around my ankle, preventing me from moving any further. "Please," I begged. "What's happening?" The pain traveled to my chest next, making my heart feel like it was going to explode. The terror of the daughter plant and fear of the uncertainty piled into the aching pain in my body was enough to send me over the edge. I fell down to my knees, clutching my hurt arm to my chest.
Cheater.
The daughter whispered again, but this time I couldn't speak. Something inside of me was inhibiting movement. My swollen tongue filled up my mouth.
Cheater.
I was yanked backwards by my ankle. The daughter plant was slithering and squirming in the air. Strands and strings hovered just above my face. I could feel strings wrapping around my body. First my legs, then my torso. My neck was last, and I thought for sure it was trying to suffocate me, but the strings only wrapped around me lightly, just to hold me in place. All around me, chrysanthemum buds and blooms drifted slowly to the ground. Hues of yellows and oranges peeked into my periphery, and for a moment, I felt safe, content even. But when the stem of the daughter plant appeared above me, hovering just over my chest, I let out one last garbled wail, just before it plunged straight into the center of my chest.
The cheater is mine now.
could feel the stem pulsing inside of me, drinking my blood, feeding on my life force. A squelching noise would sometimes leave the gaping hole in my chest, sending spurts of blood into my face. Somehow, I was still breathing. I laid there, motionless and terrified. I couldn't scream or yell or cry. I was forced to lay there and feel the daughter suck the life out of me bit by bit. The daughter was right, though. I had been the one to poison Kelly's tomatoes. All it took was a little bit of ricin and a few people to get sick enough to be hospitalized. She was disqualified, and I was closer to winning Best Garden of the Year.
Shelby.
I heard Rick scream from the porch steps, and the next minute he was kneeling down next to me. He tried to cut the daughter off of me, using a pair of kitchen shears, but the strings and strands were too thick and too tough to cut through.
What have you gotten yourself into, baby?
I passed out before I could even think of an answer. I woke up in the hospital 3 days later, with an unbearable pain in my chest. I somehow survived the attack from my daughter plant, but not without battle scars. Where the strings and strands had been so tightly wrapped around me, giant red whelps adorned almost every inch of my skin. My entire body was so sore, it was difficult to move. The doctors said I was close to death when the ambulance rushed me to the hospital, and if it wasn't for Rick calling 911, I would be dead. Too bad. So fucking sad, I guess. Because when the police started looking into my daughter plant, they had to dig up my garden and destroy every last inch of my hard work. They pulled apart my hydrangeas and ripped away my cucumbers one by one. It was all gone by the time they were finished, nothing but dirt and leaves. But what they also found buried within the roots and soil was a syringe and a vial of ricin, emulsified into a yellow liquid. Not only did I wake up with a massive hole in my chest, but I also woke up handcuffed to my hospital bed with no one in sight, only an officer standing guard at my hospital room. As far as I know, Rick hadn't visited me. What was even worse, though, was to discover that my garden had been disqualified from the contest. Horace Hayes had arrived at my house just as they were toting my lifeless body to the hospital. The police had started ripping up my garden by then. I laid my head back on the pillow behind me, letting out an agitated sigh, when I heard a sharp ding, a notification on my cell phone. Someone had made a post on Facebook and tagged me in it. Of all people to tag, why me? Surely word hadn't gotten around already. I opened the app to read the post anyway. The 2022 Best Garden in Boone County was narrowed down to 2 people Friday, when our very own Miss Shelby Lyons was found guilty of tampering with Miss Kelly Smith's tomatoes. That poor, poor girl. Hopefully she can find peace now. The competition between Miss Patty Carmichael and Miss Joanne Derryberry was a close one, but Horace Hayes ultimately made the decision. Our 2022 Best Garden in Boone County belongs to Miss Patty Carmichael for having the prettiest daisies around. Congratulations, Patty. Patty fucking Carmichael. With a surge of anger, I threw my phone across the room and it slammed into the wall, shattering to pieces. Too bad the daughter didn't suck the life out of me when I needed it most.